A man disappeared while trying to cycle around the world, and experts are still debating his fate. In late 19th century Pittsburgh, Frank Lenz is about to embark on the adventure of a lifetime. Armed with little more than a bicycle and a sense of adventure, he plans to circumnavigate the globe, documenting his travels along the way. But before he can reach his journey's end, he'll discover just how dangerous the world can be. And people will still be talking about his curious tale well over a century later. In fact, Lenz's round-the-world trip was doomed from the start. And while he braved many challenges along the way, he ultimately encountered peril that he couldn't overcome. Somewhere in the war-torn wilds of the Ottoman Empire, he disappeared, never to be seen again. And it sparked a mystery that continues to this day. So what happened to the plucky young cyclist who gambled his life on an adventure and lost? Did he fall victim to foul play, lost and alone thousands of miles from home? Or was there a more romantic conclusion to his tragic story? Although many have searched for the truth, Lenz's body has never been found. Born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in 1867, Lenz was the only son of an immigrant family from Eastern Germany. Tragically, his father died when he was just a young boy. With his mother, he relocated some 300 miles west to Pittsburgh, where he would soon develop a passion for the emerging sport of cycling. By this point, of course, cycling was far from a new phenomena. In fact, two-wheeled vehicles had been around since at least 1817. But in the 1870s, the unique penny farthing had emerged, delivering what was considered at the time to be a speedy and comfortable ride. And like many young men his age, Lenz was hooked. While still a teenager, Lenz forked out $100, an entire month's salary, on a brand new bike. With a front wheel measuring more than 50 inches across, it weighed in at a hefty 55 pounds. But however impractical, it became the catalyst that would set the young man on a path of adventure and tragedy. Keen to get the most out of his new hobby, Lenz became a member of the Allegheny Cycle Club. And at first, he seemed content to explore the sleepy lanes and roads of rural Pennsylvania. Over time, though, he started to journey further afield, riding his bike hundreds of miles to places such as New York City and Chicago. But Lenz wasn't just adventurous, he was determined, too. According to David V. Hurley, who wrote a 2014 article about the cyclist for the Wisconsin Magazine of History, he once set a regional record by covering more than 160 miles in 24 hours. And everywhere he went, he carried his trusty camera, snapping photographs along the way. Then in 1886, the British cyclist Thomas Stevens successfully completed the first circumnavigation of the globe on two wheels. Beginning in Sacramento, California, he spent more than 2 years traveling through North America, Europe, and Asia, covering a distance of about 13,500 miles. Impressed, Lenz became determined to follow in his footsteps. But while Stevens had completed the journey on a high-wheeler bike like Lenz's, times were changing fast. Some 10 years earlier, the first of the so-called safety bicycles had begun to emerge, replacing the bizarre proportions of the penny farthing with two wheels of similar size. Equipped with inflatable tires, it was being touted as the future of the sport. Hoping to capture the zeitgeist, Lenz abandoned his trusty high-wheeler and decided to position himself as an ambassador for this new technology. And pretty soon, he had secured a backer for his ambitious trip. In return for photographs from the round-the-world adventure, the Boston-based magazine Outing agreed to contribute to its costs. Having acquired a Victor safety bike, Lenz set about planning his 20,000-mile journey around the globe. Unlike Stevens, he planned to travel from east to west, traversing the United States before catching a boat to Japan and cycling across Asia and Europe. All in all, he predicted that the trip would take roughly 2 years. On May 15, 1892, Lenz set out from Pittsburgh amid a throng of well-wishers. At the time, a journalist for the Pittsburgh Dispatch newspaper commented, "He will have a long but pleasant trip, and will doubtless have some interesting stories to tell the boys on his return home." Tragically, though, he would never see his friends and family again. Before he could begin his journey west, Lenz headed east to Washington, D.C., and New York City, where he collected a passport and liaised with the outing team. Then, it was time to begin his adventure. After cycling for 12 days, he left the United States for the first time, passing Niagara Falls and crossing the Canadian border. Heading west, Lenz crossed south of the border again at Detroit, Michigan, making stops in Illinois and Minnesota. Up until this point, reports claim, his biggest challenges had been rain and mechanical problems. But on a train bridge outside Minneapolis, he experienced his first brush with the peril that would characterize the later stages of his journey. According to a 2019 article published by Adventure Cycling magazine, Lenz found himself trapped in the path of an oncoming train. And in the end, he only narrowly escaped, dangling himself and his bike off the edge of the bridge. In his missives for outing, he wrote, "My feelings at this moment can better be imagined than described." Despite this terrifying hiccup, though, Lenz was enjoying his journey west. And soon, he arrived in Yellowstone Park, where he spent several days exploring the scenery on his trusty safety bike. At one point, reports claim, the view was so distracting that he cycled off the path and fell about 30 feet. On this occasion, he was lucky enough to escape relatively unscathed. From there, Lenz continued to head west, calling at Portland, Oregon, before arriving at his last American stop, the Californian city of San Francisco. By this point, he had been cycling for more than 3 months and had covered over 4,500 miles. But now it was time for him to leave the familiarity of America behind and head out on the next stage of his journey. From San Francisco, Lenz sailed to Yokohama, Japan, arriving in November 1892. And for the next 3 weeks, he cycled west through the island, pleasantly surprised by the quality of the roads, if a little put off by the local cuisine. But it was in China that things started to take a turn for the worse. According to reports, Lenz found conditions in China to be tough, with poorly maintained roads and harsh winter weather. And to make matters worse, the locals, whom he had found friendly and supportive on the first stage of his journey, became hostile. On several occasions, it seems, he was forced to use the pistol which he had brought for protection. In the end, it took Lenz 6 months to navigate through China, instead of the 3 that he had predicted. But after a long slog, he eventually reached the British outpost of Burma, now Myanmar. There, he spent some time recuperating, apparently sure that the hardest part was over. Sadly, his trials and tribulations were only just beginning. In Myanmar, Lenz contracted malaria, which delayed his journey even further. And although he eventually made it to Rangoon, the heavy monsoon rains cast yet another obstacle in front of him. Originally, he had planned to cycle west to India, but wet conditions had rendered the route impassable, forcing him to catch a boat instead. In Kolkata, then known as Calcutta, Lenz found himself surrounded by friends once more, feted by the local cycling community as he paused to construct a new bike. And after 2 weeks, he set out again, this time heading northwest to the city of Lahore in what is now Pakistan. Over the following month, he cycled some 1,300 miles, witnessing exotic wildlife including camels and monkeys along the way. When it was time to leave Lahore, Lenz chose to head southwest to Karachi in modern-day Pakistan, rather than travel directly west through Afghanistan. Apparently, he feared that he would encounter too many hostile natives if he took the latter route. But little did he know that the worst part of his journey was still to come. From Karachi, Lenz caught a steamer to the Persian city of Bushehr before turning north towards Tehran. Again, he found himself struggling along rough, unfinished roads, but the desert landscape added a pleasant element to the 800-mile trip. And according to reports, he found the city in what is now Iran surprisingly full of charm. After a brief stop in Tehran, Lenz set out on the 375-mile journey northwest to Tabriz. By this point, it was April 1, 1894, and he was keen to tackle the wide expanse of Turkey before the summer heat settled in. But as he pressed on, he admitted to Outing's readers that the pangs of homesickness were growing difficult to bear. Despite longing for the comforts of his homeland, though, Lenz was determined to complete his journey. And so he set his sights on the Ottoman capital of Constantinople, today known as Istanbul. Leaving Tabriz, he slowly made his way to the city of Erzurum, some 300 miles to the northwest. Unfortunately, Lenz never arrived. Somewhere between Tabriz and Erzurum, he disappeared, his missives to Outing stopped, and nothing was heard from the adventurous cyclist again. As time passed, his loved ones grew concerned, and journalists scrambled to find the truth. But the mystery remains unsolved to this day. As months went by with still no word from Lenz, his family began pressuring officials in Turkey to find out more about the situation. Meanwhile, poor communication exacerbated the situation, with Outing reporting at first that the cyclist had made it to Constantinople. Soon, though, it became apparent that he had vanished. Nobody seemed to know quite where he had gone. For those familiar with Turkish politics at the time, it was a worrying development. After all, Lenz's intended route would have taken him directly through Kurdistan, where tensions between the region's Christian Armenian inhabitants and their Ottoman rulers had been simmering for generations. And by the spring of 1894 things had escalated into an all-out genocide. In fact, between 1894 and 1897 it's believed that as many as 300,000 Armenians were slaughtered on the orders of Abdul Hamid, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. When he crossed the border into Turkey, then, Lenz would have found himself at the heart of an increasingly violent and volatile situation. With no word of Lenz's fate, the public began to turn against Outing. And bizarrely, its publishers decided that the best solution was to send another cyclist to Kurdistan. This time, the plucky adventurer was William Sacktelbend from Illinois. But unlike the missing man, he was experienced in round-the-world trips. The same year that Lenz set out, you see, Sacktelbend had returned from his own two-wheeled circumnavigation of the globe. And in March 1895, he set out once more, this time to track down the missing cyclist. But Turkey's borders were closed to foreigners, and it was only by falsifying documents that he was able to make it to Erzurum. Unfortunately, the only thing that Sacktelbend uncovered there was a tragic tale. According to locals, Lenz had somehow managed to offend a Kurdish chief while passing through the region. And as he was leaving town, he was ambushed by bandits. Reportedly, he had begged them to spare his life, but they didn't listen. According to this version of events, Lenz was murdered, his body unceremoniously dumped on a nearby riverbank. But that wasn't all. Apparently, Sacktelbend believed that the truth had been intentionally covered up, with the Turkish authorities reluctant to prosecute a Kurd in a position of power. And while charges were eventually brought, the man accused of the killing escaped and fled. Reportedly, the locals who had helped Sacktelbend piece together Lenz's final moments were arrested themselves, with two tragically passing away behind bars. Heartbroken at his inability to see justice done, the cyclist headed back to America empty-handed. Without a body, he had failed to put the story to rest, and rumors have persisted ever since. According to some, Lenz was kidnapped, rather than murdered, by individuals who had hoped to receive a hefty ransom, although this part of the plan never materialized. Meanwhile, others have argued that the adventurer simply fell in love with Turkey and did not wish to return. Instead, they say, he assumed a false identity and lived out his days in obscurity. Unfortunately, though, Sacktelbend's version of events is probably the most likely. And after his findings became public, the League of American Wheelmen, a group of cycling lobbyists, launched a campaign for compensation. Lenz's mother, they claimed, had been subjected to suffering thanks to the failings of the Turkish government. The issue dragged on until in January 1900 President William McKinley adopted the cause. Reportedly, he refused to negotiate an arms deal with Turkey until officials agreed to pay appropriate compensation. And soon after that, Lenz's mother received a $7,500 indemnity payment. But the legacy of his ill-fated journey lived on. While some argued that round-the-world missions were little more than dangerous stunts, others were inspired to follow in Lenz's footsteps. But for Sacktelbend, the incident left a bitter taste in his mouth. And by the time that he left Kurdistan, he was more than happy to put that particular adventure behind him.